A young girl fights to save her family farm from a ruthless businessman, but an old toy maker's mysterious creations hold secrets that could change everything. Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe. The morning sun crept over the horizon, casting a golden glow across the worn-out farmhouse. Emily Parker stood at the edge of the porch, clutching a basket of ripe tomatoes she had picked just before dawn. The crisp morning air felt fleeting, soon to be replaced by the oppressive summer heat. In the distance, the faint sound of birdsong mixed with the soft wheezing coughs of her mother, Margaret, from inside the house. Emily closed her eyes for a moment, letting the cool air brush against her face before turning back inside. The kitchen was small and cluttered, filled with the scent of herbal tea and faint mildew from a leaky roof. Margaret sat in a faded armchair by the window, her once vibrant face pale and sunken. "Morning, sweetheart," Margaret said weakly, her voice trembling as she reached for Emily's hand. "Good morning, Mom. How are you feeling today?" Emily asked, forcing a smile onto her face as she knelt by her mother's side. "Oh, Margaret replied with a faint chuckle, like a rusty old car engine that's about to give out. Emily's smile faltered for a brief second before she quickly regained her composure. She had grown used to her mother's attempts to lighten the gravity of her illness, but it never made it easier to hear. "I made you some tea," Emily said softly, adjusting the blanket over Margaret's frail shoulders. "I'll be at the market today, but I'll be back before noon." Margaret's hand tightened weakly around Emily's. "You work too hard, Em. You should be in school, not worrying about bills and produce stalls." Emily shook her head. "School can wait, Mom. Right now she gestured around the house. "This needs me more." The old clock on the wall ticked loudly as Emily stood and grabbed her woven basket, carefully placing the tomatoes inside along with some homemade jam jars. She gave her mother one last glance before stepping out into the day. The road to town was long and dusty, lined with broken fences and fields that had long stopped yielding crops. Emily's boots kicked up small clouds of dirt as she walked, her basket swinging by her side. She passed a faded for sale sign staked into the ground near the Parker family's property line. It had been there for nearly 6 months, planted by the bank after the first foreclosure notice. But Emily kept walking, her head high, her grip firm on the basket handle. When she arrived at the town square, the market was already alive with activity. Vendors set up their stalls, the smell of fresh bread and roasted coffee beans wafting through the air. Emily found her usual spot, a shaded corner near an old oak tree, and began arranging her tomatoes and jars neatly on the rickety wooden table she had borrowed from the farmhouse. "Morning, Emily," called out a stout woman from the neighboring flower stall. "Good morning, Mrs. Henderson," Emily replied with a warm smile. The hours passed slowly. Some customers stopped to buy a jar of jam or a handful of tomatoes, others simply glanced at her stall and moved on. Emily kept her smile steady, even when her stomach growled from skipping breakfast. By midday, her small earnings jingled faintly in her apron pocket. It wasn't much, but it was enough to buy her mother's medication for another week. As she began packing up her remaining produce, a shadow fell across her table. "Afternoon, miss," said a gravelly voice. Emily looked up to see a tall man in an expensive suit standing before her. His face was sharp, with cold blue eyes that didn't quite meet hers. He was flanked by 2 younger men, both in matching suits and sunglasses. "My name's Charles Grant," the man said, flashing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You're Emily Parker, aren't you?" Emily nodded cautiously, her hands instinctively clutching the edge of the table. "Yes, sir. Can I help you with something?" "I believe you can," Charles said, his voice oozing with practiced charm. "You see, I represent a development firm that's very interested in your family's property. I understand there's been some financial difficulty." Emily's stomach twisted. She knew about the foreclosure letters, about the overdue payments. But hearing it spoken aloud by a stranger felt like a slap in the face. "We're managing just fine," Emily said firmly, trying to keep her voice steady. Charles chuckled lightly, shaking his head. "Oh, I admire your spirit truly. But let's be realistic, Miss Parker. This farm isn't sustainable and frankly, it's in the way of progress. My offer is generous and it would allow you and your mother to start fresh somewhere easier." "We're not selling," Emily said sharply, her voice trembling slightly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to get home." Charles raised an eyebrow as if surprised by her defiance. But he simply nodded and stepped back. "Very well, Miss Parker. But do think about it. Time is rarely on our side in these situations." As Charles and his men walked away, Emily felt her knees weaken. She gripped the edge of the table for support, her breath quick and shallow. "Emily, are you all right?" Mrs. Henderson's voice came from behind her. Emily nodded slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm fine. I need to get home." She packed her things in silence, her thoughts racing with worry and fear. By the time she reached home, the sun was dipping below the horizon. Margaret was asleep in her armchair, her frail chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Emily sank onto the floor beside her mother, clutching the small handful of dollar bills she had earned that day. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her chest, heavier than it had ever been before. Outside, the wind blew softly against the farmhouse walls, carrying with it the faint sound of distant thunder. The morning sun filtered through thin curtains in Emily Parker's modest kitchen as she carefully poured tea into her mother's cracked porcelain cup. Margaret sat in her chair by the window, her frail hands trembling as she lifted the warm cup to her lips. Outside, the faint sound of Emily's dog Rusty barked somewhere in the fields. "Emily," Margaret said softly, her voice like fragile glass, "you came home late yesterday. Did something happen at the market?" Emily hesitated as she wiped down the already spotless kitchen counter. The image of Charles Grant and his cold blue eyes hovered in her mind. She forced a smile and turned toward her mother. "Just a slow day, Mom. Nothing to worry about." Margaret's eyes searched her daughter's face, but exhaustion kept her from pushing further. Emily placed a gentle kiss on her mother's forehead before grabbing her basket and heading out toward the town square again. The air was warmer today, heavy with the smell of fresh-cut grass and distant rain clouds. Emily walked briskly, her basket filled with more tomatoes, a handful of herbs, and a few jars of homemade jam. But today her steps felt heavier, as though the weight of their financial struggles and Charles Grant's looming presence followed her like a shadow. The town square bustled with life when she arrived. Vendors shouted out prices, children laughed as they chased each other between stalls, and the smell of baked bread mingled with flowers and roasted peanuts. Emily set up her table under the shade of her usual oak tree and began arranging her modest goods. It wasn't long before her routine was interrupted by a sound, a faint creak like the turning of old wood. Emily glanced up and spotted an elderly man slowly pushing a wooden cart toward the far corner of the market. His back was slightly hunched and his white hair peeked out from beneath a flat cap. The cart was filled with wooden toys, carved animals, miniature rocking horses, painted dolls, and intricate puzzles. Emily couldn't help but stare. In a marketplace filled with produce and flowers, wooden toys seemed so out of place. The man stopped near her stall and began setting up his display with methodical care. His hands, though wrinkled and trembling slightly, moved with precision as he placed each toy on a red checkered cloth. Emily hesitated before calling out, "Good morning, sir." The old man looked up, his pale blue eyes sharp and alert despite his frail frame. A warm smile stretched across his weathered face. "Good morning, young lady," he replied, tipping his hat. "You're quite early today." Emily chuckled lightly. "Early bird gets the worm, or so they say." The man nodded, his smile softening. "My name's Walter Hayes. And you are?" "Emily. Emily Parker." Walter's smile faltered briefly as if the name triggered a distant memory, but he recovered quickly. "Well, Miss Parker, it seems we're neighbors in the marketplace today." Emily couldn't help but let her eyes wander across the toys. Each piece seemed to carry a story, as though the wood itself had been shaped by whispered secrets. "Your toys, they're beautiful," Emily said softly. Walter's smile grew wider, and he leaned slightly on his cart. "Thank you, Emily. Each one carries a bit of magic, you know. A story carved into its bones." Emily's brow furrowed. "Magic?" Walter chuckled, a sound like the creaking of an old rocking chair. "Not the kind with wands and spells, dear. The kind that lingers in memories and whispers through time. Toys aren't just objects, they're companions, storytellers, and sometimes, they're bridges." Emily felt a chill run down her spine, though she wasn't sure why. Walter seemed kind, his voice gentle, yet there was something about him, something unspoken, that made her feel as though he knew far more than he was letting on. After a moment of hesitation, Walter spoke again. "Emily, how would you feel about selling a few of my toys at your stall?" Emily blinked in surprise. "Sell your toys? But, why me?" Walter's expression turned serious, his pale blue eyes locking onto hers. "Because I believe you'll do them justice. And because you look like someone who understands how important a little hope can be." Emily swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry. She glanced at her modest table of tomatoes and jam jars and then back at Walter's intricate wooden creations. I'd be honored," she said softly. Walter's face broke into a wide grin, and he began carefully selecting a few of his toys: a small wooden train, a carved bird with painted wings, and a doll with button eyes. He placed them gently in Emily's basket. "There. These should do well for today," Walter said. "We'll split the profits evenly. Fair's fair." Emily nodded, still processing the sudden turn her day had taken. She arranged the toys neatly on her stall, placing them near the front where they would catch the eye of passing children. It wasn't long before customers began to take notice. A little boy tugged on his mother's hand, pointing at the wooden train with wide eyes. A young girl picked up the carved bird, running her fingers over its painted feathers with awe. "Where did you get these?" Mrs. Henderson asked as she admired the doll. "They're unlike anything I've seen around here." Emily hesitated, glancing over at Walter, who was now sitting on a small wooden stool beside his cart. He caught her eye and gave her an encouraging nod. "From Mr. Hayes over there?" Emily said with a smile. By the end of the day, every toy Walter had given Emily was sold, and the earnings in her apron pocket were heavier than they had been in months. Emily felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Walter approached Emily's stall with his empty cart creaking behind him. "Well, Miss Parker, it seems you've done a fine job today," he said warmly. Emily handed him his share of the money, but Walter shook his head. "Keep it, Emily. You'll need it more than I do." "But—" "No buts," Walter said firmly, though his smile remained kind. "We'll call it an investment. In you and in hope." Emily felt tears prick her eyes as she nodded. Walter tipped his hat again and began pushing his cart back toward the narrow path leading out of the market. As Emily watched him disappear into the twilight, she felt something shift deep in her chest. A spark, faint but persistent. For the first time in a long while, it felt like the world was beginning to turn in her favor. But in the shadows of the town square, unseen by Emily, Charles Grant stood watching. His cold blue eyes narrowed as he observed the exchange between the girl and the elderly toymaker. And in his gaze, there was something far colder than curiosity. The market square buzzed with life as Emily carefully arranged Walter Hayes' newest wooden toys on her small table. Each toy, whether a miniature rocking horse, a carved bird with painted wings, or a doll with button eyes, seemed to carry a life of its own. They weren't just objects, they were stories frozen in wood and paint. Emily glanced across the square where Walter sat beside his cart, his cap pulled low over his white hair, hands busy sanding a small block of wood. Despite the chaos of the market, he radiated calmness, an island of stillness in a sea of noise. "Excuse me, miss," a soft voice pulled Emily from her thoughts. A young boy, no older than 7, stood in front of her table. His worn-out clothes and dirt-streaked face told a familiar story of struggle. He was staring wide-eyed at a carved wooden bird painted in bright shades of blue and gold. "It's beautiful," he whispered, his fingers hovering above the delicate wings. Emily smiled warmly. "Would you like to hold it?" The boy hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the coin pouch tied around his neck, no doubt holding his family's precious few dollars. "It's okay," Emily said softly, handing him the toy. "Go ahead." He took the bird gently, cradling it as if it might come alive in his hands. His face lit up, a smile so pure it made Emily's chest ache. "Can I tell you a secret about that bird?" Emily asked, leaning closer. The boy nodded, his eyes wide with curiosity. "This bird is special because it's brave. No matter how strong the wind or how high the storm clouds, it always keeps flying. It never gives up, no matter how hard things get." The boy looked down at the bird again, his smile fading slightly as he clutched it tighter. "Does it ever get tired?" he asked quietly. Emily's throat tightened, but she forced her voice to remain steady. "Sometimes. But then it remembers why it's flying, and that keeps it going." The boy nodded, his little hand still wrapped around the toy. He hesitated before untying the small coin pouch from his neck. Emily reached out, stopping him. "Take it with you," she said softly. "It's a gift." The boy's eyes welled with tears as he whispered, "Thank you." He turned and ran back into the crowd, clutching the wooden bird like it was the most valuable treasure in the world. As Emily watched him disappear into the bustling square, she realized Walter had been watching the exchange. He gave her a small nod, a faint smile curving his lips. The sun dipped lower in the sky as the day wore on, painting the town square in warm hues of gold and orange. Emily had nearly sold out of the toys Walter had given her, and her basket of tomatoes was down to just a few stragglers. It was then that a woman approached the stall. She was impeccably dressed, her tailored coat and leather gloves hinting at wealth and influence. Her sharp green eyes scanned the table before settling on a carved wooden horse. "These are remarkable," the woman said, her voice clipped but intrigued. "Where did you find them?" "They're made by a local toy maker," Emily replied cautiously. "His name is Walter Hayes." The woman raised an eyebrow. "Hayes, you say? Interesting." She picked up the wooden horse, running a gloved finger along its polished surface. "I'll take this one. And tell Mr. Hayes that I'd like to meet him. Tomorrow, same place." Emily nodded, barely able to stammer out a reply before the woman turned sharply and walked away, her heels clicking against the cobblestones. As the market began to wind down, Emily approached Walter's cart with the day's earnings clutched in her apron pocket. Walter was carefully packing away his tools, his movements slow but precise. "I sold almost everything today," Emily said, handing him his share of the earnings. "And there was someone asking about you. A woman. Well-dressed, sharp. She said she wants to meet you tomorrow." Walter froze mid-movement, his hands hovering over a half-packed box of toys. His face darkened for the briefest moment before he let out a slow breath and nodded. "Thank you for telling me, Emily," he said quietly. Emily hesitated. "Do you know her?" Walter's pale blue eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw a flicker of something, regret, maybe even fear. "Perhaps," he said simply. The farmhouse was quiet that evening. Margaret was already asleep in her armchair by the window, and Emily sat at the small kitchen table counting the day's earnings. It was more than she had made in months, and yet the foreclosure notice still sat like a lead weight in her pocket. The wind outside howled against the wooden walls, carrying with it the faint scent of rain. Emily stared at the small wooden bird Walter had given her earlier, a twin to the one she'd gifted the little boy at the market. She turned it over in her hands, her thumb running over the tiny carved feathers. "You're brave," she whispered to it. "No matter how high the storm clouds." A sharp knock at the door shattered the silence. Emily's head snapped up, her breath catching in her throat. She crossed the room cautiously and peeked through the curtain. Her stomach dropped. Charles Grant. Emily opened the door just enough to see his face, but not enough to invite him inside. "Good evening, Miss Parker," he said smoothly. "Still not ready to accept my offer, I assume?" Emily tightened her grip on the doorknob. "No." Charles sighed dramatically, placing a hand over his heart. "You wound me truly. But I'm not here for business tonight. I just wanted to remind you, time is ticking." Before Emily could respond, Charles reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small wooden toy, a bird. It was identical to the one Emily had gifted the little boy at the market earlier that day. Her blood ran cold. "Lovely little thing, isn't it?" Charles said, inspecting the toy as if it were a priceless artifact. "But toys, they break so easily, don't they, Emily?" He placed the wooden bird back into his pocket, gave her a curt nod and turned away into the darkness. Emily slammed the door and locked it behind her, her chest heaving with fear and anger. She glanced at the wooden bird on the kitchen table, its painted wings glowing faintly in the dim light. Outside, the wind roared and storm clouds began to gather over the Parker farm. The rain fell in relentless sheets against the Parker farmhouse, drumming on the tin roof and seeping through cracks in the window frames. Emily sat by the kitchen table, staring at the wooden bird Walter had given her. Its tiny wings, painted in soft blues and golds, seemed almost fragile in the flickering light of the lantern. Her mother, Margaret, coughed softly from her chair by the window, her blanket pulled tightly around her frail shoulders. Emily's thoughts kept circling back to Charles Grant, the way he had held that identical wooden bird, the way his sharp blue eyes had gleamed with something sinister. How had he gotten it? And why had he come here in the middle of the night to show it to her? The farmhouse felt colder than usual. At dawn, Emily stood at the edge of her property, the muddy ground squelching under her boots as the rising sun broke through the heavy clouds. In the distance, the silhouette of the market square was beginning to stir to life. She tightened her scarf around her neck, her breath visible in the crisp air. Today she needed answers. When Emily arrived at the market, Walter Hayes was already there. His wooden cart was neatly arranged with freshly carved toys, and he was hunched over a small block of wood, whittling away with his pocket knife. Emily approached quietly, her basket clutched tightly against her side. "Morning, Walter," she said softly. Walter glanced up, his sharp blue eyes meeting hers before he nodded in greeting. "Good morning, Emily. You look troubled." Emily hesitated before speaking. "Charles Grant was at our house last night." Walter froze. His knife stilled against the wood, and for a brief moment, his shoulders slumped ever so slightly. Slowly he set down his knife and the half-carved toy. What did he want? Walter asked, his voice low. Emily swallowed hard. He had one of your wooden birds. The same as the one I gave that little boy yesterday. He said toys break easily. Walter's face went pale, and he leaned heavily on his cart for support. His blue eyes, usually filled with warmth, were now clouded with something else. Grief, perhaps, or maybe fear. Walter, Emily pressed gently, who is he to you? Walter let out a long, shuddering breath, his weathered hands gripping the edge of the cart. For a moment, Emily thought he might refuse to answer, but then he nodded to a wooden stool beside his cart. Sit, Emily. There's a story you need to hear. Emily perched on the stool, her heart pounding in her chest as Walter began to speak. Many years ago, Walter began, his voice quiet but steady, I was a different man. I had a family, a wife and a son. We lived in a small cottage near a forest not far from here. I made wooden toys even then, though they weren't as refined as they are now. Life was simple and we were happy. Walter's gaze drifted toward the horizon, as though he were looking through time itself. But happiness, it's a fragile thing, Emily. My wife fell ill one winter, and despite my every effort, she didn't make it. After she was gone, my son, his name was Charles, grew distant. He was only a boy, but grief turned him hard. He wanted more than the life I could give him, a bigger house, better clothes, money. Walter's voice cracked, and he paused to steady himself before continuing. One day Charles announced he was leaving. He said he was going to make something of himself, that he wasn't going to waste his life in a dusty old workshop surrounded by toys no one cared about. We fought, Emily. I said terrible things and so did he. He walked out the door and I let him go. Emily felt tears stinging her eyes as Walter's voice trembled. I waited for him day after day, hoping he'd come back. But he never did. I heard rumors, stories about a man building an empire out of land and steel. A man named Charles Grant. I knew it was him, but I couldn't bring myself to face him. The boy who left my home that day wasn't the same man who built that empire. Walter reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden bird, nearly identical to the one Emily had on her kitchen table. He held it delicately in his trembling hands. I made this for Charles when he was little. He loved birds, the way they could soar high above the world, free from the weight of the earth below. This was supposed to remind him of that freedom, of home. Walter placed the bird gently on the cart beside him. But Charles, he isn't free, Emily. He's bound by chains of his own making, greed, anger, regret. And now he's here, circling back to this place, to you, to me. I don't know why, but it's not good. Emily felt her chest tighten. The pieces were starting to come together. The wooden toys, the way Charles had spoken to her, the stormy look in Walter's eyes. Charles Grant wasn't just some businessman, he was Walter's son. A son who had walked away from love and returned with cold ambition. The wind picked up, scattering leaves across the cobblestones. Vendors bustled around the market square, but to Emily, it felt as though the world had narrowed to just her and Walter. What do we do, Walter? She asked softly. Walter let out a long breath. We keep going, Emily. We keep selling these toys. We keep fighting. And when the time comes, we face him together. Emily nodded, determination hardening her features. She stood up, her basket clutched tightly against her chest. I won't let him take our home, Walter. I won't let him win. Walter's lips quirked into a faint smile. You remind me of your mother, Emily. Strong, fierce. Don't lose that. As Emily walked back to her stall, the weight of Walter's story hung heavy on her shoulders. Charles Grant wasn't just an adversary. He was a man haunted by his past, a man whose bitterness had turned into greed. But despite everything, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, buried beneath layers of arrogance and anger, there was still a flicker of something human inside him. But would it be enough? That night, Emily sat by her mother's bedside, the foreclosure notice still folded in her apron pocket. Margaret's soft breaths filled the quiet room as the lantern flickered beside them. Emily held the wooden bird in her hands, its painted wings glowing faintly in the dim light. We'll fight, she whispered to it as if it could hear her. No matter how high the storm clouds. Outside, the wind began to howl again, and somewhere in the shadows of the night, Charles Grant was watching. The first light of dawn crept over the Parker farmhouse, painting the sky in muted shades of pink and orange. Emily stood at the kitchen sink, staring out the cracked window at the fields beyond. Her mother was still asleep in her chair, her frail form rising and falling with each shallow breath. The weight of Walter's story and Charles Grant's looming threat pressed down on Emily's chest like an anvil. But today fear would have to take a backseat. Today she had a plan. By mid-morning, Emily was back in the market square, but this time she wasn't alone. Margaret had stayed behind, and instead of focusing on her small stall, Emily went from vendor to vendor, speaking in hushed but determined tones. "We can't let him win," Emily said to Mrs. Henderson at the flower stall, clutching her hand tightly. "If he takes our farm, he'll come for the rest of you next." Mrs. Henderson's usually cheerful face grew somber as she nodded. "You're right, Emily. This town's been good to all of us. We can't just let him trample over it." One by one, Emily spoke to the grocer, the butcher, the baker, the families who set up handmade crafts on fold-out tables every weekend. Some were skeptical, others fearful, but most listened. Most understood. By noon, a quiet buzz had spread across the market square. Vendors whispered to each other as customers passed by, heads turned toward Emily as she made her rounds. And standing near his wooden cart, Walter Hayes watched it all unfold with a knowing glimmer in his sharp blue eyes. The town meeting took place that evening in the old community hall, a creaky wooden building with flickering lights and folding chairs that had seen better days. It had been years since so many people had gathered there. Farmers, shop owners, parents holding their children close. All filled the rows, their faces etched with worry but also determination. Emily stood at the front of the room, her hands clutching the back of a rickety chair for support. Walter sat nearby, his wooden cane resting against his knee, his eyes fixed on the crowd. "Thank you for coming," Emily began, her voice trembling slightly before she steadied herself. "You all know me. I'm Emily Parker, and you know about the farm my family's been fighting to keep. But this isn't just about our farm anymore. It's about all of us." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. "Charles Grant doesn't just want our land. He wants control. And if we let him win, it won't stop with us. He'll come for your homes, your shops, your families. We can't let that happen. We have to stand together." A man near the back, Mr. Whitaker, the owner of the town's hardware store, stood up. "But what can we do, Emily? He's got money, lawyers, connections. We're just ordinary people." Emily's voice grew stronger. "Ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they work together. We can show Charles Grant that we're not just names on a ledger or plots of land on a map. We're a community. And we won't let him take what's ours." Walter slowly rose to his feet, leaning heavily on his cane. The room fell silent as he spoke. "I've known Charles Grant for a long time," Walter said, his voice rough but steady. "Long enough to know that men like him aren't stopped by fear or by money. They're stopped by something they don't understand, something they can't buy: unity." The crowd shifted, a quiet murmur passing through the room as heads nodded and hands tightened around chair backs. "So what do we do?" Mrs. Henderson asked from the front row. Emily stepped forward, her gaze sweeping across the room. "We make noise. We tell our story. Tomorrow we'll set up in the market square, not just as vendors but as a community. We'll let everyone know what's happening. And if Charles Grant wants to come for us, he'll have to look every single one of us in the eye." For a moment the room was silent. Then someone clapped. Then another. And another. Soon the small community hall was filled with applause, with shouts of agreement, with a spark of hope that hadn't been felt in years. The next morning the market square was unlike anything Emily had ever seen. Vendors had set up their stalls not just to sell but to protest. Hand-painted signs were propped up against crates of tomatoes and baskets of flowers. "This land is our home. We won't be moved. Community over greed." Walter sat by his cart, his toys carefully displayed, but today he wasn't carving. He was watching, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd as families, children, and elderly townsfolk gathered. Emily stood near the center of the square, her voice carrying over the morning chatter. "We're not just fighting for a farm today," she called out. "We're fighting for every home, every family, every story that's been written here." People cheered. Mrs. Henderson handed out flowers to children, tying little notes of encouragement to the stems. The baker gave away small pastries, smiling as people stopped to read the signs he had propped up in front of his stall. And then, Charles Grant arrived. His sleek black sedan rolled to a stop at the edge of the square, and he stepped out, flanked by two men in dark suits. He wore his usual cold expression, but something flickered across his face as he looked around, a hint of unease, perhaps. Emily stepped forward, meeting him halfway. "Good morning, Mr. Grant," she said, her voice clear and strong. Charles looked around, his sharp blue eyes scanning the crowd. "Quite the eye display you've organized, Miss Parker." "It's not a display," Emily replied. "It's a message." Charles smirked faintly. "And what message is that?" "That you can't scare us into silence. You can't buy us out of our homes. This town is more than just property lines and dollar signs. It's people, stories, and history. And we won't let you take it from us. A murmur of agreement passed through the crowd. Charles's smile faltered slightly, but he quickly regained his composure. "We'll see about that, Miss Parker," he said coolly. 30 days. Don't forget." With that, he turned on his heel and walked back to his car. But this time, Emily noticed something different. He wasn't walking away with the confidence he had before. There was doubt in his step, a hesitation that hadn't been there before. That night, as Emily sat by her mother's bedside and listened to the faint hum of crickets outside the window, she felt something she hadn't felt in weeks: hope. They had taken a stand. They had shown Charles Grant that they wouldn't go down without a fight. And somewhere in the quiet dark, Walter Hayes sat in his workshop, carving another wooden bird. Its wings spread wide, painted in shades of gold and blue. A symbol of courage. A symbol of hope. But the storm wasn't over yet. The morning sky was heavy with clouds, threatening rain as Emily hurried down the worn dirt path toward the market square. Her breath fogged in the cool air, and her basket swung at her side. Today felt different. The air crackled with something she couldn't quite name. Anticipation? Fear? Oh. When she arrived, Walter Hayes was already seated by his wooden cart, his sharp blue eyes watching the world from under the brim of his cap. The faint sound of his knife carving would fill the silence between them as Emily approached. "Good morning, Walter," she said softly. Walter looked up and gave her a small smile. "Good morning, Emily. The clouds look heavy today." "They do," she replied, glancing at the sky. "But rain might be good. Wash away some of the dust." Walter chuckled quietly, a sound like creaking floorboards. "Sometimes storms clean more than just dust, child." Emily hesitated before asking, "Walter, do you think we're making a difference? All of this, standing together, fighting back, do you think it's enough?" Walter set down his carving knife and looked Emily in the eye. "Hope isn't measured in victories, Emily. It's measured in how many people refuse to give up, no matter how bad the odds look." His words sat heavy in her chest, like an anchor holding her steady amidst the uncertainty. The day passed slowly, a steady trickle of customers moving through the square despite the ominous sky. Emily sold more tomatoes and jam, but it was the toys, Walter's toys, that caught the most attention. Children would linger, their small fingers tracing the carefully carved details of wooden birds, trains, and dolls. By early afternoon, a man appeared at the edge of the square. He was tall and thin, wearing a faded overcoat and holding a leather briefcase. His face was lined with age and weariness, and his eyes darted nervously as he approached Walter's cart. Walter froze as the man came closer. Emily watched, sensing something fragile and unspoken pass between them. "Walter Hayes?" the man asked, his voice thin and trembling. Walter nodded slowly. "That's me." The man opened his briefcase and pulled out a small, dust-covered wooden toy, a carved soldier with faded paint and a missing arm. "I found this in an attic," the man said, his voice cracking. "It belonged to my brother. He died years ago, but this toy was his favorite. Your name was carved on the bottom. Did you make this?" Walter reached out with trembling hands and took the wooden soldier, turning it over carefully. On the base of the soldier's foot was his name, W. Hayes. "I did," Walter said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I made this a long time ago." The man's eyes filled with tears. "My brother carried this toy everywhere. Even when things got bad, during the war, during the nights we didn't think we'd make it, he held on to this little soldier like it could protect him." Walter's lip trembled, and for a moment, he seemed lost in a sea of old memories. Emily felt tears prick her own eyes as she watched the exchange. The man nodded, clearing his throat. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes. For this. You gave him something real when everything else was falling apart." He turned and walked away, leaving Walter holding the tiny soldier in his weathered hands. For a long moment, neither Walter nor Emily spoke. The air felt thick with something sacred, something fragile. Later that evening, as Emily packed up her stall, she noticed Walter staring intently at something in his hand. She approached carefully. "What is it, Walter?" Walter held up the tiny wooden soldier, his eyes distant. "Toys aren't just toys, Emily. They're memories. They're lifelines. They carry pieces of us in them, pieces we don't even realize we're giving away." Emily sat down on the edge of his cart, watching him. "This soldier," Walter continued, "it wasn't just wood and paint to that boy. It was courage when he had none, hope when everything felt lost. And now," he looked up at Emily, his blue eyes glistening. Now I think I understand something about Charles. Emily's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? Walter set the soldier carefully on the cart and exhaled shakily. Charles was just a boy when he left. Angry, stubborn, full of fire. But I wonder, if I had made him something like this, something he could carry with him, would things have turned out differently? Emily hesitated before speaking. Maybe it's not too late, Walter. Maybe there's still something you can give him. Walter's gaze turned sharp, focused. He reached into his cart and pulled out a block of wood, his carving knife glinting faintly in the fading sunlight. I think you might be right, Emily, he said softly. It's not too late, not yet. That night, the rain finally came. Thunder rumbled across the horizon, and fat droplets drummed against the farmhouse roof. Emily sat by the window, holding one of Walter's wooden birds in her hand. Margaret slept peacefully in her chair, her breathing steady despite the storm outside. Emily turned the bird over in her hands, tracing its delicate wings with her fingertips. Outside, in his small workshop tucked away on the outskirts of town, Walter Hayes worked late into the night. His hands, though aged and trembling, moved with precision as he carved into the wood. Each cut, each groove, each detail was deliberate. He worked until his eyes blurred and his fingers ached. When he finally set down his knife, the storm was beginning to quiet, the rain tapering into a gentle drizzle. Walter looked down at the toy he had carved, a wooden soldier just like the one he had made so many years ago. But this one was different. Its face was softer, its details more refined. Its pose was one of strength, of resilience. Walter turned it over and, with slow care, carved a name into the base. Charles Grant. The next morning, Emily found Walter waiting for her at the market square. He held the wooden soldier in his hand, wrapped delicately in brown paper and tied with twine. I need you to do something for me, Emily, Walter said, his voice steady. I need you to give this to Charles. Emily hesitated, her fingers brushing against the twine. Walter, what if he doesn't listen? What if he doesn't care? Walter's eyes were clear, filled with quiet determination. Then at least I'll know I tried. Emily nodded, clutching the small package tightly against her chest. The storm had passed, but the air still carried the scent of rain, fresh, clean, and full of promise. But somewhere in the distance, the dark shadow of Charles Grant's empire loomed large. And Emily knew the hardest part of their fight was still ahead. The sun was just beginning to rise as Emily stood outside Walter's small workshop. The light painted the sky in soft hues of lavender and gold, and a thin mist clung to the fields around them. Inside, Walter Hayes sat at his workbench, clutching the small wooden soldier he had carved for Charles all those years ago. His usually steady hands trembled slightly, and his sharp blue eyes, so often filled with quiet wisdom, were now clouded with uncertainty. He's coming today, isn't he? Emily said softly from the doorway. Walter nodded but didn't look up. Yes, he is. Emily stepped inside, the old wooden floor creaking beneath her boots. She placed a gentle hand on Walter's shoulder. You've waited a long time for this moment, Walter. He's coming back because of you. Walter let out a long, uneven breath. It's not because of me, Emily. It's because of you. You brought him this far. You gave him that soldier. You reminded him of who he was, and who he could still be. Emily shook her head. No, Walter. That toy, that tiny wooden soldier, did something I never could. It carried a piece of you straight to his heart. Walter turned to her, his eyes filled with gratitude. Whatever happens today, Emily, thank you. Thank you for believing in me, in us. Before Emily could respond, the faint sound of tires crunching gravel reached their ears. Both of them turned toward the workshop door as a sleek black sedan pulled up to the edge of the property. The engine cut off and the door slowly opened. Charles Grant stepped out, wearing a sharply tailored suit, but today there was something different about him. His posture wasn't as rigid, and his sharp blue eyes, so often cold and calculating, were softer, filled with an emotion Emily couldn't quite name. Walter slowly stood from his stool, leaning heavily on his cane. Emily stayed by his side as Charles walked toward them, the gap between father and son closing with each step. When Charles finally stood just a few feet away, silence stretched between them, a silence filled with decades of unspoken words, buried regrets, and heavy emotions. Walter's knuckles turned white around the handle of his cane, and Charles's chest rose and fell with uneven breaths. "Hello, Dad," Charles said softly. Walter closed his eyes briefly at the sound of that word, Dad. When he opened them again, they shimmered with unshed tears. "Hello, son," Walter replied, his voice trembling. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Emily felt as though the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the fragile stillness. Then, slowly, Charles reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out the wooden soldier Emily had given him. Its painted details caught the morning light, and Charles held it out in his open palm. "I kept it with me," he said, his voice cracking slightly. It's the only thing I've had from you all these years." Walter took a shaky step forward, his cane pressing into the earth. His hand hovered over the soldier for a moment before he gently took it from Charles's palm. His fingers closed around it, and he held it against his chest as though it were the most precious thing in the world. "I'm so sorry, Charles," Walter whispered, his voice breaking. "For everything. For letting you leave, for not chasing after you, for all the years I let pass without trying to make it right." Charles shook his head, tears brimming in his sharp blue eyes. "No, Dad. I'm the one who's sorry. I let my pride, my anger, my greed, I let it ruin everything. I built my empire on trying to prove something to you, and in the end all it did was build a wall between us." Walter reached out with trembling hands, placing them gently on Charles's shoulders. "But you're here now. That's all that matters." Charles let out a shuddering breath, and for the first time in decades he stepped forward and wrapped his arms around his father. Walter's cane slipped from his grip and fell to the ground as he clung to his son, his frail frame trembling with sobs. Emily turned away, tears streaming silently down her face as she gave them their moment. The wind rustled softly through the trees, carrying away years of bitterness and regret, replacing them with something fragile but strong, hope. The three of them sat around a small wooden table in Walter's workshop. Sunlight poured in through the windows, casting a warm glow over the carved toys scattered across the workbench. "So what happens now?" Emily asked, breaking the silence. Charles cleared his throat, his voice steadier now. "The foreclosure, it's off. I'll speak to the bank, make sure they stop all proceedings against your farm, Emily. And I'll make sure you and your mother are secure for the future." Emily's breath hitched in her chest. "You mean it?" Charles nodded, offering a small, genuine smile. "You and your mother have been fighting so hard. You deserve peace." Walter placed a hand on Charles's arm. "And what about you, son? What will you do?" Charles hesitated, looking down at his hands. "I don't know yet. But I think I'd like to stay here for a while. Maybe help fix up the farm, spend some time with you." Walter's smile was soft and radiant. "I'd like that, Charles. I'd like that very much." Emily felt warmth flood her chest. The once imposing figure of Charles Grant was now just a man, a son seeking redemption, a father seeking forgiveness. And together they had found something precious in the quiet corners of Walter's workshop, a second chance. That evening, Emily walked home under the glow of the setting sun. In her pocket was a small note scribbled by Charles, promising the foreclosure was no longer a threat. In her heart was something even more valuable, a renewed belief in the power of connection, forgiveness, and hope. When she reached the farmhouse, her mother was waiting by the window, her frail hands clutching a knitted shawl. Emily rushed inside, threw her arms around Margaret, and let out a long breath she felt like she'd been holding for weeks. "It's over, Mom," Emily whispered. "We're safe." Margaret pulled back, her eyes glistening with tears. "Oh, Emily, thank God." Outside, the wind carried the soft scent of blooming flowers, and the field stretched endlessly beneath the fading light. Somewhere in the distance, Walter and Charles stood together by the old wooden fence, their shadows long against the golden horizon. The storm had passed. The scars remained, but the path forward was clear. And somewhere on Walter's workbench sat a small wooden soldier, standing tall, its carved face turned toward the light. The morning sun rose gently over the Parker farm, casting warm golden light across the fields. The air was fresh, carrying the scent of dew-kissed grass and the faint chirping of waking birds. For the first time in what felt like forever, Emily Parker stood on her porch without the crushing weight of uncertainty pressing down on her chest. The foreclosure was officially called off. The Parker farm was safe. Emily stepped onto the porch, a steaming cup of tea cradled in her hands as she looked out over the fields. They weren't much, patches of dry earth, stubborn weeds, and scattered vegetables, but they were theirs. And that was all that mattered. In the weeks following Charles Grant's return, the farm began to transform. With Charles's financial support and his newfound humility, repairs began on the Parker farmhouse. Workers replaced broken shingles on the roof, patched up cracks in the walls, and repainted the peeling wooden panels. Charles, no longer the cold businessman Emily had once faced, worked alongside them. He traded his tailored suits for rolled-up sleeves and work boots, his once pristine hands now stained with soil and sweat. His sharp blue eyes no longer carried their icy edge. Instead, they glimmered with quiet determination. Walter Hayes, though older and slower, was often found at the edge of the property, carving toys on a makeshift stool under the shade of an old oak tree. His hands, though frail, moved with precision, and children from the nearby town often wandered over to watch him work. Emily divided her time between helping her mother, working the farm, and attending school again, a dream she had nearly given up on. Margaret, her health steadily improving with proper medication and care, spent her mornings knitting by the window, watching her daughter's world grow brighter day by day. One Saturday afternoon, the farm hosted a gathering, something the Parker land hadn't seen in years. Tables were set up under the wide expanse of the sky, covered with homemade pies, jams, and fresh produce. Children ran between the rows of vegetables, laughter echoing across the open space. The scent of grilled food hung heavy in the warm air. Emily stood by one of the tables, arranging jars of jam when Charles approached her. He wore a simple shirt and jeans, his sleeves rolled up, a light sheen of sweat on his brow. "You've done something remarkable here, Emily," he said softly, looking out over the celebration. Emily smiled, her hands still arranging the jars. "We did something remarkable, Charles. None of this would have been possible without you, or Walter." Charles nodded, his sharp blue eyes softening as he glanced toward his father. Walter was sitting on a wooden stool beneath the oak tree, surrounded by children who eagerly watched him carve a small wooden bird. For every cut he made into the wood, he shared a story, his voice calm and steady. "I spent so many years building towers of steel and glass," Charles said quietly, his voice tinged with regret. "But none of it feels as meaningful as this." Emily turned to him, her smile warm and sincere. "Sometimes, it's not about how high you build but about how deeply you're rooted." Charles let out a soft chuckle. "Wise words, Emily Parker." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching as families and friends came together in the warm glow of the afternoon sun. As the sun began to set, Walter slowly approached Charles, his wooden cane tapping softly against the ground. In his free hand, he held a small object wrapped in a square of cloth. "Charles," Walter said, his voice carrying across the fading light. Charles turned, his breath catching slightly as he saw his father approaching. Walter stopped in front of him and carefully unwrapped the cloth, revealing a small wooden music box, its surface etched with delicate carvings of trees and birds. "I made this for your mother years ago," Walter said softly, his weathered hands holding the music box carefully. "She always said it sounded like home." He placed the music box in Charles's hands. For a moment, neither man spoke as the faint sound of the music box's delicate tune began to play, a lilting, bittersweet melody that hung in the air like a whisper. "I can't change the past, son," Walter said, his voice trembling. "But I hope this helps us move forward." Charles swallowed hard, his head nodding as he fought back tears. "It does, Dad. It does." The two men embraced once more, the music box still playing its quiet tune between them. In the weeks that followed, the Parker farm became more than just a home, it became a sanctuary. Walter received a brand new workshop built on the edge of the property, a space filled with natural light and the faint scent of sawdust. His toys became a treasured part of the town, their stories whispered through generations. Emily returned to school, her bright mind finally free to focus on her studies. Yet every afternoon she could still be found at the market square, selling jars of jam and Walter's wooden toys under the same old oak tree. Charles, though still running his business, began spending more and more time at the farm. He traded boardrooms for open fields and quarterly reports for simple conversations beneath the wide sky. His cold exterior had melted, replaced by something softer, warmer, a man rediscovering what it meant to truly live. One evening, Emily stood at the edge of the farm, the sky painted in brilliant hues of pink and orange. Walter was in his workshop, the faint sound of his carving filling the cool evening air. Charles stood nearby, leaning against the porch railing as he watched the sun dip below the horizon. Margaret's laughter echoed softly from the open window behind them. Emily closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of earth and wood shavings, the faint melody of the music box still lingering in her ears. For the first time in what felt like forever, everything felt right. Not perfect, not without scars, but right. She turned to Charles, her voice soft but firm. "You know, Charles, we wouldn't have made it without you." Charles smiled faintly, his sharp blue eyes reflecting the golden light of the setting sun. "No, Emily. We wouldn't have made it without each other." The sun finally disappeared beyond the horizon, leaving behind a sky filled with stars. And on the Parker farm, a new chapter had begun. One filled with hope, resilience, and the quiet magic of wooden toys carved with love and stories. The storm had passed. The night was clear. And the future stretched out before them, open and filled with promise.